Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the transmission out of my 1986 4Runner. In the previous couple videos, I took the transmission out of the truck because it was having this crazy grinding issue. And then I split the cases and I found that the input bearing was actually bad. So in that video, I was asking you guys, what do you think I should do? Should I keep tearing it apart or should I just replace the input bearing? And basically everyone said, take the whole thing apart since you're already there. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. So as I mentioned in the last video, I've never rebuilt the transmission before, but I've been watching a lot of videos on YouTube about rebuilding these W series transmissions. And I gotta say, it's really increased my confidence and I feel like I could tackle this job pretty successfully. And I'll go ahead and link the channel that I've been watching on the screen somewhere right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with taking out the shift rods and the shift forks and these interlocks right here, and then I'm gonna be bagging and tagging them in their corresponding bags for fifth and reverse, third and fourth, and first and second. Looking back at this footage, I wish that I would have narrated it as I was taking it apart, but I didn't, so I'll just go ahead and do it now. Each one of these plugs has a ball and a spring behind it. Looking at it from the top to bottom, the topmost rail is the first to second rail, followed by the third to fourth rail, followed by the fifth and reverse rail. Each plug that I remove is going to have a spring and a ball under it. The balls aren't magnetic, so you will have to dump them out each time. I'm putting everything into labeled bags to make sure that I don't lose anything. Now that I removed those detents, I'm gonna go ahead and get started on removing the shift rails and the forks. If you've ever installed gears before, you've definitely seen these little locking tabs on the bolt, and they have the same thing in the transmission right here. So we're gonna knock that down with the flathead screwdriver, and then we're gonna remove the bolt. And you'll also have to take out the clip on the shift rail right here. All right, now I'm gonna remove this little snap ring right here. Once again, this is a trick that I learned from just watching videos on YouTube. I'm going to kind of put some tape around this thing so that it falls in the tape and doesn't go flying. Just gonna wrap it kind of around the shaft like this. And then I'm gonna smack this thing out of here with a pair of pliers and a hammer. Well, it didn't quite work, but it didn't go flying either, so the snap ring's out. I got the rail removed for 1 and 2 and it was honestly really easy. So as you can see, I have this marked right here. I've said it several times. This is my first time rebuilding the transmission. I'm not trying to fake it out here. I'm not an expert. I need to make sure that things are labeled in a way where I won't get confused. So even though this might be really obvious to some of you, it's not so obvious to me. So I marked it 1, 2, and I'm just gonna put it to the side over here. Now before I take out the rail for 3 and 4, if you look into the hole where we removed the 1 and 2 rail, there's a little ball in there, and that's the interlock. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna shove a paper towel in there so that when we remove 3 and 4, or when we're working on it in the future, that doesn't fall out and we don't lose it. So I'm gonna do that first, and then I'll remove this rail. I messed up, but not in a bad way or everything's screwed way, just in a way that I, was just talking about. When I was saying that I have to stuff paper towels into this area so that the interlocks don't fall down, I forgot to do it as I was pulling the rail out for the one right next to it. And you can see the interlock fell down in there. So what I'm gonna do is just use a flathead to pull it back up and then stuff paper towels in there. But just small mistakes as I'm just learning and going through this. So here's all the hardware from that 3/4 rail. We have the rail just like the 1 and 2, and the fork and the bolt and the locking tab. But we also had this little pin as well. And this pin came from the side of the rail right here, and it just kind of drops in there. So when I put this back in, I just have to make sure I have that in place. All right, this is the first trace of metal that I found other than the initial find in the last video. Got some shavings right here in the area where the shifter rails were in. This little groove right here. So some signs of carnage right there, but not really seeing anything else that stands out as being immediately, I guess, broken besides this input bearing. So yeah, we're just gonna keep taking it apart. I'm gonna start working on a 5th and reverse now. So I have to remove this plate right here, and it's held on by a 14mm bolt. Just gonna break that free real quick. And remove the bolt. And it should allow this rail and the gear behind it to slide out. This shaft right here should just wiggle out like that, and then the shaft right here has a pin that's holding it in. So if you have like a roll pin punch or just any punch in general, you can knock this pin out right here and then pull this shaft out. So here's everything that was removed when I was taking out that shift rail. So I have the shift rail itself with the fork and this gear that goes next to it. You can see I've labeled them 5/R for 5th and reverse, just to keep everything organized as I've previously mentioned. And we have this linkage right here, this detent ball that actually went inside the linkage right here. And then we have the actual pin that held the fork to the rail. So I'm gonna put all this stuff in the same bag so I don't get it mixed up. And now I have a lot cleaner of a transmission to start working with. So I already know that I have to replace this bearing here. We've already established that. This one over here feels a little bit messed up as well. It just feels a little bit grindy and hard to turn when you're spinning it. So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start going through this and seeing if there's any documentation that I can find for testing clearances and testing to see if bearings are good or bad, because I don't want to tear it all the way down if I don't have to. I'm thinking I might have to dig deeper into it anyway though, because this cluster shaft has a lot of play. I'm not sure if that's how much play this is supposed to have, but that seems rather excessive to me. Alright, so I found a couple of articles talking about checking clearances between this bearing and the 5th speed gear, for example, but nothing really going on to check play in the cluster shaft or anything else. So I'm just gonna take it apart. I'm already here anyway. I already have it out of the truck. I should just take the whole thing apart. So I'm taking off the snap ring right now, and then I'm going to use a puller to pull off this bearing and the gear behind it. All right, we got the bearing, spacer, gear, and a needle bearing that looks to be a split bearing that goes inside the gear. So this bearing that I thought was bad is definitely bad. Listen to this. When I took that bearing and the gear off, these little metal shavings fell out of the back of the bearing. So it's a good thing I took that off. I'm just finding more metal shavings as I go throughout this thing, and I really don't think I'm gonna have one single good bearing left. Probably just gonna have to replace them all. So behind that gear, there's another very small washer right here. We're gonna take this off and put it aside, make sure we keep it in order. And then there's a snap ring under here that we're gonna probably have to remove. And this Synchro, let's get this out of the way. And then we're going to pull this guy off. So on this Synchronizer hub, there's this little thin metal ring behind it that we have to be careful of, apparently, when pulling this thing off. You could damage this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to get my puller just right on the edge here. And if I can get some confidence when I'm pulling this that I'm not gonna snap or crack this hub, then I'm gonna go through with it. Otherwise, might have to find another way. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and set the puller on this and see if I can pull it out. Man, this transmission has some tight press fits on it. It's a bit crazy. No damage to that hub. So we might have got lucky, or maybe that's just the way that you do it. But that thing came off there pretty easily, with an impact at least. I was trying to do it with a wrench and it was a little bit harder, but I tossed the impact on there and kind of sent it, and yeah, no damage anywhere. It came off. We're good to go. I just wanted to show you guys real quick how I'm keeping everything organized. So I cleaned off this area on my storage shelf, and you can see I'm keeping everything in order. So we have the snap ring, the bearing, the spacer, the 5-speed gear, the Synchro, the other spacer, the other snap ring, and everything having to do with that Synchronizer hub right here. So I'm keeping everything organized, so when I put it back together, I know how it goes in order on that cluster shaft. So I think the cluster shaft is actually done. I don't think there's anything I have to take off here to get it out. I think I need to start on this shaft up here, and I'm pretty sure this sleeve where the transfer case goes into has to come off next. So I'm gonna take this thing off now. We have a slight problem here. The puller is not long enough. So it looks like we're headed off to the parts store to grab some new tools. I knew I wasn't gonna have all of the pullers required for this job before I even started it. I just didn't think it would happen so early on in the process. So as you guys saw, this puller right here did not have the jaw length required to take that sleeve off. So I'm gonna head to the parts store now and grab a new puller. So it's about a week later, I picked up this Shankly bearing separator kit. It's the kind that has these big pieces that go behind the bearing, and you could pull it off either using a press, or you could use this guy right here, which will push against the shaft that the bearing is on, and then this will pull the bearing off of it. I chose this one just because the actual jaw puller ones, for one that was long enough to get that off, they're very expensive. So as you'll see here, I already took off the sleeve that was on the output shaft off camera. So that's this guy right here. It just sat on the end of the shaft like this, and I pulled it off with that kit just by putting it behind this area of the sleeve. And then I started pulling off this 5th speed gear and bearing as well. Now these are really hard to get off, and what I did was I sprayed PB Blaster in between the shaft and the bearing and the gear, and I just kept soaking it for like a week. And I came out here and started taking that thing off with the puller. Had to kind of use the hammer on the end of the puller. So if you could imagine, the puller's here like this, and as I'm tightening it, I'm hammering the end of it to kind of give some shock or some impact to the bearing to get it off. And as you can see, it has started to come off. So what we're going to do now is we're going to remove this bearing and this gear. So now that I have that bearing and gear removed, I need to take this reverse gear off. So what I have to do is pop this snap ring off right here and then get this reverse gear off of these splines. Now I don't have a puller that's long enough to go from the end of this shaft all the way to behind this gear. So what I've seen people do is they take the snap ring off and they hammer the end of the shaft to push the shaft this way and force the gear off of the shaft that way. So that's what I'm going to try to do right now. So this is working, and it's coming off the splines right here. Just a couple more hits and this thing should come off of here. Okay, so while that's kind of an unorthodox way to get that gear off of there, it definitely worked, but I gotta be honest, I'm kind of confused how it did work, because yeah, we're hammering the end of this, but it doesn't really have much movement back and forth, so what's actually driving it forward? I guess it doesn't matter, the gear still came off. So now what I'm gonna do is take off the bearing retainer by taking out these Torx bolts right here, and then take off this snap ring on the cluster shaft, and I should be able to pull both shafts out of this mid plate. The bolts that hold this retainer on are a Torx 40, and we're just gonna take them off. That one was kind of loose, or it felt loose at least. Maybe that's just how tight these things are. Yeah, they're just not very tight. Now we're fishing out that snap ring that was under that bearing retainer. Just got to get this out of here, and I think that this shaft will come out. I don't think there's anything holding it after this snap ring comes out. There it is. I'm gonna take the snap ring off the cluster shaft too, just so that both shafts are free and nothing's holding them back. I think it'll be easier to take everything apart that way. So I guess I'm just gonna start hammering this and see if it comes out. Looks like it is. So I've kind of found out that if you hit each shaft like one at a time like this, it kind of works them out together. So you can see they're starting to come out of this mid plate right here. So I'm just gonna keep hitting them and they should come out. So there's the cluster shaft. It just came out. Should be able to wiggle this thing out of here. Just like that. And now the main shaft is out too. Oh, there's a little race right here. That might have been what was holding it back. So I need to get this race out of this mid plate before I move forward. There goes the race. The race is out. Now that both of the shafts are removed, we can take that race that we pulled out of the mid plate and we can take off this split bearing from the cluster shaft right here. And then we can grab our cluster shaft and put it to the side and get started on the main shaft. Alright, so now we're going to take off this input shaft. It should just pull right off. And it did. And this is our fourth gear as well. There's going to be a bearing inside of this on the end right here. So this is a pilot bearing that just goes into the end of this fourth gear input shaft here. So make sure all this stays together. And we're just going to put it to the side. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off this snap ring for the third and fourth synchronizer hub right here, and then we're going to take off the gear with the hub together. With third gear out of the way, now I have to take first gear off along with the main bearing. The problem is that the puller set that I just bought doesn't fit around this, and the second gear doesn't fall between the two legs of my press. So I'm gonna have to get a little bit creative to press this thing off. And this might end up being a little bit sketchy, but hopefully it works. Alright, so here's what I'm going to try to do. I have these two 2x4s just standing up vertically with these two pieces of flat bar that are going to be used to press this bearing up as I drive the shaft down. I know this is not the right way to do this. You don't have to tell me this is the wrong way. It is the only way that I have of getting this off. I'm not willing to just go buy another puller set when this might work, so I'm going to go ahead and try it. And if it fails, I will go buy the right tools, but it might work. It's working. It's not a very tight press fit, so it's actually coming out really easily. Look at that. Sometimes you can get the job done with just pieces of wood and random scrap steel. Alright, so we have a bearing. This collar, and the gear, a needle bearing that goes inside the gear like this, let's get this synchronizer ring out of the way. There should be a ball bearing in this shaft somewhere right here. This ball bearing keeps that race from spinning around on the shaft, so we got to get that guy out. Alright, so I'm just going to put this needle bearing into the gear over this collar, sleeve thing, race, whatever you want to call it. Drop this ball bearing into there so I don't lose it. Put the synchronizer ring on top of it, and then just take this bearing and move everything just out of the way so that I don't get it mixed up or lost. Now we're going to press off second gear and the 1-2 synchronizer hub the exact same way that we got the other gear off. This one's going to be pressed off in the normal way because my puller actually fits over this gear. So we're just going to press this thing out. That came out way too easy, no effort at all, but hey, it's out. So as you guys saw, that gear basically just fell off of the shaft, but what we have here is second gear, we have the synchronizer ring, the synchronizer hub, and then we have the needle bearing that actually goes inside of the gear this way. And then we have the main shaft with this might not come off actually. This might be casted into it. So I guess that's really it. The whole transmission's torn down. Alright, so as you guys can see, I have the whole transmission torn down here, and I have everything laid out in a way where I can easily follow it. So I have the main shaft along with everything that goes on the main shaft here, and I have the cluster shaft along with everything that goes on the cluster shaft here. So I have fourth gear and the input shaft, the snap ring that went after it, third gear, second gear, first gear, the main bearing, the bearing retainer, reverse gear, the counter gear for fifth gear, this bearing, snap ring, and the collar that goes to the output shaft. We have the mid plate over here, cluster shaft. We have the entire assembly, the whole snap ring, spacer, bearing, fifth gear, clutch hub, and all that stuff lined out over here, as well as the actual split bearing and race that goes on the cluster shaft right there. So really easy to follow, just keeping everything organized. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you for following along as I tore this thing apart. As I mentioned several times in this video and the previous ones, this is my first time tearing a transmission apart, so there's bound to be some mistakes throughout the video in terminology or just how I took something apart, but for the most part, it wasn't that hard. I feel like as long as you have YouTube, the right tools, and some mechanical knowledge, you can tear one of these things apart. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later. At the top of the class on a roll, and it's time to run it up, yeah you know. Maxed out, put the pedal to the floor. Hey, on the road, here we go. Yeah, we winning by a landslide. Never see me coming on my landmine. Yeah, I ain't taking orders in command like. Yeah, you about to see me on demand like. You know on demand. If you ain't know, you about to understand. Yeah, I got the team by my side, right hand. Yeah, take it to a string.